So let's talk about what a Merge-Purge, what does it provide? Service bureaus are the ones typically that provide Merge-Purge. What's meant by merge priority? And what are things that we as a co-op can take away from a merge report or maybe even from the session? So let's talk about what do they provide. Sometimes a customer will update their own customer file went through the process of a Merge-Purge rather than running extracts or updates on a regular basis. Some of these mailers might wait, collect all the transactions since the last time they did an update through a merge, and then run the new transactions in the merge to make sure that they're mailing their own customer file with the proper recency. So if they have a record that purchased 4 years ago and also purchased 30 days ago, they want to identify that customer record as somebody who's a 30-day buyer. And they want to be able to know that it's a 2-time buyer. So they'll update sometimes, it's not all the time. They'll update their own customer database when in the process of a Merge-Purge and make sure they're not mailing any duplicates, but getting the best recency associated with that customer record. They also NCOA. Most of these service bureaus contract with the post office to get an instance of the latest NCOA file from the post office. And they want to make sure that records that have moved, that are known on the NCOA record, that they, on the NCOA file, that they mail them under their proper address or the most recent address. So that generally happens in a merge. Address standardization, usually this happens outside of the Merge-Purge process. Is usually a setup process. Well, they'll run all the addresses that are potentially going to be mailed through a process where they standardize the address to ensure the best deliverability. I would imagine we see very few records that have to be corrected on our part, but different people use different files to do address standardization. So there's always going to be a few in there that slip through. Pre-sort, and this is a process that happens at the end of the Merge-Purge process to put the records that are going to be mailed in the most positive way for postal discounts. That's typically mostly by carrier code, but sometimes it's even more defined than that. What they're trying to do is maximize the discounts that they get from the post office by making it easier to sort and deliver. Consolidate duplicates. This is what most people think a Merge-Purge is for. I've got records coming in from rental lists, not necessarily co-op lists, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But if I'm Sharper Image and I'm mailing the Hammacher-Schlemmer file, there's a good chance that some of those folks that are on the Hammacher-Schlemmer file are also on my customer database, and I don't want to mail them as a Hammacher-Schlemmer prospect. I want to mail them as a customer. So that's one way to eliminate dupes. And the other thing is, if I'm Sharper Image, I'm mailing a bunch of different lists, whether it's co-ops, Hammacher-Schlemmer, Brookstone, those types of lists. There's probably going to be duplicates across those. And I want to make sure that I only want to mail them one catalog. So if I've got the same name from 3 different lists, I only want to make sure that they get one catalog. Most of the time, those duplicates, let's say I've got 3 of the same names across 3 different lists, they're typically randomly allocated to those. And there's a whole math problem associated with how that record gets randomly allocated, because sometimes there's 2 duplicates, sometimes there's 4 duplicates, sometimes it's across the same set of lists, and they have to account for all that so it's fair. That's what random allocation essentially tries to do, is allocate those duplicates fairly across the various lists that are going into the merge. Some folks take their older house file names. Let's say that I'm a brand like Sharper Image, for instance, and it's off season and in the spring, and I only want to mail my 24-month file. What I'll do as a mailer is I'll bring in my 25+ month names that I wasn't intending to mail, but I'll allow those records to match the rental lists that come into the merge to sort of light them up. Those are called super dupes. And this brings in this whole concept of priorities that we'll talk about next. But the idea is I shouldn't have to pay for a name that I already own And there's always been sort of a gray line, and that gray line has been sort of evaporated now. But if Hammacher Schlemmer provides me the same record that has purchased from them in the last 3 months, but hasn't purchased from me in 40 months, do I have the right not to pay Hammacher Schlemmer for that information? And I would say in the old days, when I first started in this industry, the answer was no. In the new era of Merge-Purge, nobody cares, nobody looks at it, and they just count it as a house file hit. And so Sharper Image takes that information and uses it to mail those records. And then the other thing that they do is they run in their do not mails. These are customers who wrote into the Sharper Image, for instance, and said, hey, I just don't want to receive your catalog anymore. And that's where they apply that do not mail. They make sure they apply it across their house file list and any rental lists. And then there's also do not rents. And these are records that have come in since the last update that I want to flag on my file that says, these are records that customers said they still want to receive the Sharper Image catalog. They just don't want to have my name rented to any other list, which includes co-ops. That's the difference between a do not mail and do not rents. And sometimes that flag gets appropriated in the merge as well.
We see a lot of do not rent flags given to us in input data, but it sounds like the way you're describing it here, shouldn't it really be the client's responsibility not to provide those records at all? I'm just wondering what the balancing act is there.
They should. So in the appropriate way for co-ops to deal with that is, okay, this was a record, this flag is do not rent. So therefore we ignore that transaction or that customer from that particular participant. But let's say it's not a do not rent elsewhere. So let's say it's a do not rent on the Sharper Image. Somebody took the time and said, don't rent my name. But they didn't take the time on the Hammacher Schlemmer file to put the do not rent flag on there. So then we allow that transaction to come in. So that doesn't directly answer your question, but yes, if the mailer is doing a bang up job, they wouldn't even send us the do not rents to begin with.
Okay, and then on our side, we're kind of responsible for consolidating that information to see where those do not rents actually apply, title-wise.
Yeah, well, it's individual title, like I said. Do not rent, when it's supplied by a mailer, isn't universal across the co-op. So we still use the data on the other list that record shows up. There's a bunch of different types of reports that happen out of this. They provide broker reports to show net percentages for potential charges and changes to the rental list invoices. So what that means is that the broker report has a various amount of categories, but it kind of starts with, here's the list name, here's the list ID. Sometimes the list ID is just like number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those types of things. Sometimes it's the source code. And then they provide the name of the list going in, and they say, here's the gross input. Here's all of the records that were dropped in address standardization or hygiene. We usually call it just hygiene. Then you've got a gross input or a net input. And then that goes through the Merge-Purge process. And then they identify against those records, they say, here's how many records hit my house file. And typically invoices get adjusted for records that hit against the house file. Now, as a co-op, we really shouldn't see many drops. I'll talk about this a little bit later, because we should have a full instance of the brand's house file resident on our co-op. So if we see a large number of hits against the house file on a broker report, or they're deducting a bunch of names or a bunch of revenue from us off of the invoice because we hit the customer file, then something's wrong somewhere. Now I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But one of the key things that comes out of the Merge-Purge is a set of broker reports. There's another thing called the interaction report. And just to give you an idea of how sick I can be, in my old days as a mailer, these interaction reports literally could be 10 inches high and probably about, I'm measuring here, about 16 inches wide. And it was this green bar. And the interaction report shows how one list interacted with every other list that went into the merge. So if I'm mailing 100 lists as the Sharper Image, you can imagine why that thing would be so big. Those merge reports could get giant at holiday season. But there's a lot of information that is contained within that interaction report. Is there a list that I am hitting up against my house file a lot? Are there certain lists that have low nets or high nets. That is indicated generally of performance. So there's a lot of information inside that interaction report. A lot of people look at it, most people don't. Sometimes a mailer will apply a house file scoring for selection or suppression. I think most mailers still mail with basic RFM selections, but sometimes they apply a model to records to score their house file to help them better select their names if they believe in the way that they're creating their scoring algorithms. Sometimes they include third parties, whether that's for selection or suppression. A third party list might be, I don't want to mail anybody that's under the age of 25 or whatever it is. They might include that as a suppression file, and you'll see that in the broker report as well as files suppressed. So normally those will just show up as house dupes. Another thing that they do is they create multi-pools. So in the instance, when I talked about names being generated off of 3 lists, but they don't appear on the house file. So they appeared on Brookstone, Hummaker, Schlemmer, and Harrington's. 2 of those catalogs aren't around anymore. But I paid essentially for the right to mail those records. So I don't want to lose that. As a mailer, that's pretty important information because that represents a great potential prospect for the sharper image. That's somebody who's buying from all of my competitors, but have never bought from me. So I want to retain the right to mail that at a future date in a future campaign as many times as I paid for it. And it should be only that. So if a record only appears 3 times, I've got the right to mail it in this campaign and the next 2 campaigns, if that's when I choose to mail the multis associated with that particular campaign. The DMA Pander file. So the DMA, we apply the DMA Pander file. These are people that wrote into we used to be the DMA, now it's the ANA. With the DMA, and these are people that say, absolutely, I don't want to appear on any list. Now, what was really interesting in the old days, and I really don't encourage anybody to ever look at this, but I'm going to tell you, we did take a look at the DMA Pander file when I was in my prior job, my prior life, and some of the best buyers out there appeared on the DMA file. Doesn't mean you should rent them. Matter of fact, you get in big trouble if you do, because part of what has made the industry work is because there's a lot of trust that goes involved. So if you have the DMA Pander file, you are supposed to be suppressing those records from the rental list. Now, as a mailer, as the sharper image, if I've got a record who's recently purchased from me and is also on the DMA Pander file, I'll probably mail that record, even though it was on the DMA Pander file. And then most importantly is the creation of the mail file. And we'll talk more about what goes into that and the promoted history for response analysis, which has become kind of ubiquitous now in terms of measuring performance. Most mailers do some form of matchback where they take the subsequent responders, the people who purchased within X days, let's call it 30 days, and match it back to a mail file so that they get a response rate associated with each list that was mailed, including their customer records.